So today it's my great pleasure and privilege to introduce my oldest friend, Claire MacDonald, who I've known for well over 50 years, which is amazing. So Claire has had a very long career in the arts, and she's arrived at this point in her journey as a minister in the Unitarian Church. I remember you back in the 1970s in Impact Theatre Cooperative, and that to me was just opening up a whole new world. And then Claire went on to, she's taught at university level around theatre and dance in the UK, in the US and in Norway. And you're the editor, and you set up, I think, Performance Research, is that right?
Yeah, in the mid-90s, yeah, with two friends.
So you've done a lot of writing over the years. And I mean, it's most amazing career. And now you're the minister at, it's called Lewisham Unity, isn't it?
It's now called Lewisham Unity. It's a Unitarian meeting house. So it's the base, if you like, of Unitarians in that part of South London. And we decided to rename ourselves as Lewisham Unity. It says a lot about who we are. So yeah, Lewisham Unity.
Well, shall we go into Lewisham Unity and then maybe circle back to our childhood experiences?
Okay, well, both of those things are linked, actually, Sorrel, in some ways, because Lewisham Unity isn't that far from where we grew up, actually.
No, it's not.
And I was born in Beckenham, and then, of course, we both grew up in Petts Wood.
Yeah.
I think really about, 8 miles away from Lewisham Unity, directly to the south. So we're both South London girls, really. Or it was when we grew up. It was just on the edge, sort of on the green edge, really, of what
it was green in those days.
London.
Yeah, and we both had younger sisters who were in the same class at school, I believe.
I think so. So you're younger than me, and I'm nearly 8 years older than my sister, who I think is Stephanie's age, actually.
Yeah, that's right. And I'm 4.5 years older than Stephanie. So yeah.
Okay. There we are.
Our two families were very closely linked, weren't they?
Yeah, our families are closely linked. And I mean, literally, we lived 5 minutes walk from you.
Yeah.
And we've talked before, actually, and about the way in which, because for a long time you sort of take your own child for granted, don't you? But we talked about the way that our mothers were, in a way, misfits in that sort of, lower middle class background. They were both thinkers in some ways.
They were.
They took life really seriously. They were quite left wing. They were quite socially concerned and quite creative. And I often look back at that stage of our lives and think that they were really hemmed in, actually.
And I think the fact they had each other important.
There's that lovely picture you sent me, actually, of them both, because we moved to Scotland when I was 13, and then you came to stay with us for a holiday, and there's a picture of my mother and your mother paddling in the sea in Ayr in Scotland, which is, they're so young.
I know, and I looked at that photograph and I thought, goodness, my mother must have missed Claire's mum so much.
Yeah.
After you moved away. As a child, I just didn't appreciate that,
I agree. They were just grown-ups. And so that it was a very sort of conventional place, really. And one of the things I remember about growing up with my mum, I mean, first of all, I remember that your mum struggled to get an education and eventually became a probation officer. She was one of the first people I met who was so pro-young people and very critical of the way that the police behaved and very, very aware of racism as well.
Yeah.
And what I remember about my mother in those kind of terms was that my mum had to vote Liberal in a very important election when Eric Lubbock became the MP. But my mum voting Liberal was moving way to the right. And I remember there was no point in voting Labour. So, I really grew up with that environment. And it wasn't that my mum was an intellectual or anything like that, but she had a really passionate belief. Actually, this really relates to who we are. I mean, I think they've got this passionate belief in our rights of access to culture, to dance, to the arts. I mean, not to art so much, actually, but to books and public libraries and choirs and decency and all those kind of human values. And I think that's something that our mothers, I think they shared that a huge amount.
I think so. And that passion for social justice as well.
Yeah, and a passion for social justice.
Yeah.
And it kind of, I mean, I can't remember how old you were when your family joined Quakerism, because it wasn't, you weren't always Quakers, were you?
I think I was about 13 years old.
Right.
Something like
that. That was very important as well to your family.
Yes, it was. And actually, because my mother had taken us out of the Sunday school at the local Methodist church after we were preached hellfire and damnation. So after that, we had, apart from what we got at school, we had no exposure to religion in any shape, in any form. And then she discovered the Quakers, and it's like, I guess it's like coming home, actually.
Yeah. Well, you were the first. Well, you actually weren't the first people that I knew, because Celia Brown and her family, she was in my class, my primary class. They were also Quakers, so I'd had some exposure to Quakerism. But I rather really went to the Congregational Church through my mum, which was very independent, and I really like that, because again, I think that it was a great community. It had a choir. And it also was about, I don't know, this sort of bigger sense of what life was about, a bigger sense of meaning. So for me, that was really important until I moved to Scotland. But that's a whole nother story.
A whole other story. But actually, that kind of brings us back to Lewisham Unity, doesn't it? And the role of that community in the bigger community of Lewisham, if you like, or the relationship between the meeting house and the community. So can you tell us a bit more about what happened when you went in as a minister?
Well, it's funny to make that link. I mean, I used to go to Lewisham Market with my mum, when I was a little girl. I used to always go and get fabric. In fact, there's still a really good fabric shop in Lewisham. And my sister lives in Lewisham as well. So there was something quite natural about me going to Lewisham Unity once I trained. So, I trained, as you've said, I obviously had a long career in the arts. And I was really privileged to be able to do a postgraduate degree at Heathrop College, which is a Jesuit-led college in the 3 Abrahamic faiths, in Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, and then to have a ministry training. And then I came to Lewisham Unity, which is a very, very small Unitarian community historically. But I kind of like that. It's a sort of small is beautiful thing, really. It's got a big garden, and it kind of, I think since I've been there, it's about 3.25 years. It's always been lively. It's had its ups and downs, but we have this hashtag Sacred Meets Social, and it's really become something of a kind of activist hub. But in the sense of that, my role partly is supporting people's sense of inner awareness and inner flourishing in order to also be able to flourish in the community. So Lewisham's community, I think, is we're in Catford, really, in South Catford. So I think there's a sense in which there is a real commitment to community. It's very diverse. It's got many cultures living in the borough, and lots of small community organisations and arts organisations. So we're one. We kind of we share commonality with lots of other organisations and faith organisations in the environment, really, in the neighbourhood. So yeah, that's kind of where we started.
And it sounds like you've grown it from when you first started there.
It's grown differently, and the people who are coming now, there are younger women in their 20s coming particularly. So yesterday we had a gathering that we call Cafe Connect, which we often have on a Sunday morning. We always meet on a Sunday morning. And this one was with a woman called Hannah Gretton, who works for Lewisham Citizens UK, because we're thinking about joining. So she's a Christian, and she's a real activist, and her work is about social justice. And so she was talking to us about joining. They've got a big listening project in South London, really, really listening to people in order to empower them. And so that's quite a sort of typical of what we want to do in our community. And that was brought to us by one of our members, Simone Riddle, who works for Lewisham Local. And what all of those younger people who are coming and talking to me are saying is that they want somewhere where they can kind of reach into their own sense of spiritual life and how that connects with the bigger life that they want to lead as well. So it's about support and nourishment, but it's also about pleasure and joy. I mean, we had a lot of fun yesterday. So that's also part of it. I've got to
That
say.
is really important.
It's really important.
Yeah.
It's really, and it's really important. It's also community. It's kind of collective. It's about a sense of belonging, but without and this is something that we were talking about yesterday, without a sense of being prejudged or pulled into something that seems extremely welcoming and then is actually not radically inclusive. So we are very much a community that supports LGBTQ plus lives flourishing. And that's also something that brings people to us, and it's really, really important.
And can you say a little bit more about the relationship between the sacred and that lived experience that people have? When you're talking about inner development and development of the community.
Yeah, I think so. I often quote, and I probably can't quite remember the quote, but the writer Ursula Le Guin, who I've been a big fan of for many years, and she says something like, the greatest religious problem today is how to be a mystic and a militant. You know, how to expand inner awareness and have social justice and be effective in both those things. So I think that idea of nourishing a sense of the inner life, that's one thing, in order to live well in community. But also I think another person who's influenced me is a Catholic writer, John O'Donoghue, and he talks about the need to have ritual, ceremony, practice because we're in a sense continuously crossing thresholds. It's like we're always on the moving edge of something, and needing to be able to mark that, to acknowledge it in equitable ways, in different ways, in creative ways, in order to have a sense that something is traveling with us. So I was thinking about this question the other day and thinking about the fact that you really, really have it when you conduct a funeral. And 2 years ago, as I think you might know, I conducted a funeral for a member of Blackheath Morris.
Yes, you remember you said.
That funeral, it was very, very clear. I mean, they had such a fantastic practice of honoring somebody who just gone. And so there was singing and dancing and all. But it wasn't just about, having a good time or a shindig. It was also about using our collective voice and the way that we can be together to really share more deeply. And I think we all have that need for that spirituality at that level, I think.
It's interesting, isn't it? I know with my family, the one time we are guaranteed to come together, all the cousins, is when someone has just died. And of course, you led my father's funeral, so you saw that. And it's a time of sharing things. I mean, stories that I didn't know about my father, which go back to our childhood and stuff like that.
It was amazing. I mean, your father's funeral was very beautiful and very simple and very in keeping with who he was. And that sense almost that he was almost present. And your younger sister, Sharon, at the funeral, over in the grounds where we were. What did she do exactly?
She actually led in the, what do you call it, the pallbearers with my father's coffin. She led them in with her accordion, playing them a march, which is like a funereal pace. And then she played her, what's it called? The little, I think of the word for it. That little thing that sounds like a guitar and is much smaller. And while we sang in that song, it was so difficult. We chose what I thought was a very simple song, and it wasn't the least simple to sing.
I know, it wasn't at all simple. But it was very beautiful. And, it's like the occasion. I mean, death is such a huge occasion. And it's the kind of honoring of the death, the marking of the death, gives permission to open up to things and emotions and spirituality that you wouldn't otherwise have. So you completely lose the embarrassment.
It's true, actually. You do open up in a very different way, don't you? Because you know that you're standing on that threshold between this world and the other world as that person just passed into it.
And it was a particularly beautiful occasion, and you and your sisters were the first up on the dance floor afterwards as well. I remember
dancing? I don't recall that.
Well, yeah, yes, lots of dancing after your dad's funeral, wasn't there? Or was that at your?
No, I think of my 60th birthday party.
I completely interesting. Gosh, that's so interesting, because we after your dad's funeral, we went to we had a meal. We went to the pub.
Yeah, we went to the pub and we sat around sharing stories.
That's right. And then the Morris funeral I conducted did have dancing, and then
there'd be dancing there. Yeah.
And that's really lovely, actually, those sort of conflating those things. But yeah, so that sort of sense of what that spirituality is. And I suppose, you know, quite a lot of people I know have become celebrants as they've got older, and they're conducting funerals, weddings, often funerals. But for me, ministry and actually being able to have that sort of that connecting role in a community and out of that community is so important that I wouldn't want to just be a celebrant, if you like, conducting on that threshold. The other things have to be present as well.
So all of those pointers in our lives.
Yeah, absolutely.
So tell me about your concept of the divine. And I know that you talked about it as the more, but then you told me that you have lots of different words, and I understand that, because so do I.
Yeah, you do.
So when you called it the more, but that one intrigued me.
Well, that I've talked about that a few times. I was talking about it the other day, because that really came to me through Jesuits. I mean, they had two beautiful things. I'll say the one first, which isn't the more, but we were in a class one day with Jesuits, and actually the same person who talked about the more. We were talking about the afterlife, and he said, you know, the one concept of the afterlife, he said, is simply to be printed on the memory of God. And that idea, and I thought about it so much, and I thought it's so beautiful. It doesn't, and that's whether you believe in God or not, because it's the idea that we are not lost, that somewhere something about us remains material. You know, we're stardust. We remain in some way in the universe, and that creates whatever the memory of this extraordinary place that we're in, you know, this universe that we're in is. We are printed on its memory. And that same person, Damien Howard, had talked at a conference that I'd been to before I did my master's degree. And it was a conference about the philosopher Charles Taylor, who was also there, who's someone I really admire. And Damien got up and talked about the community work. Jesuits all, you know, they all work in community. And he said, you know, this is the big question. Are we merely building the community centre? We, the people here who are all involved in some kind of religious life, or is there something more? And if there's something more, what is it? And so he didn't say we're doing it for the glory of God, or I'm doing it because I believe in God, or I'm doing it because God's asked me to or called me to. He just said, what is it? You know, what is the more? And that idea has stayed with me so much, because it seems to me that it is where it is. And in a sense that we're always looking for this very fleeting thing that is the more. We know that it's present. We have a sense in our heart that it's present. But we can't always say what it is. And yet perhaps it's one of the most important things to our human life. But without it, we cease to be properly. We cease to flourish. We can't be. It's like not having a sense of smell or a sense of taste or a prior perception or a sense of where we are in the world. We need that. And another theologian that I've liked a lot, Peter Berger, who's a Lutheran and also with Thomas Luckman wrote The Social Construction of Reality. He said that in the end, it doesn't matter whether we created it, not as a fiction, but whether we created it, what he calls the sacred canopy, or not. It's still ours, it exists, and we're here with it. And I think that sense, so all those things being printed on the memory of God, having a sacred canopy above us, about the more, they don't ask us to stand on the kind of ledge of belief and say, you know, I'm going to heaven when I die. They basically say, you know, we're more than the sum of our parts. And that's where that's what it means to be here.
And that's very, to me, that's really interesting because as a Quaker, I came to the idea of there being an inner light.
Mm.
And recently I came across an American doctor called Lisa Rankin who talks about an inner pilot light, which to me is the same thing. And she says it is the foundation stone of your entire life.
Yeah.
And it can never get broken or shaken or rocked. It doesn't fall away because it's at the level of the ground. So it's about your grounding as well, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I think when we're talking about innate wisdom, that's where the innate wisdom is coming from. And it, as I see it, it's coming from the divine, whatever you want to call it. And I love the idea of the more, because like you said, there's more to it than we can possibly know.
That sense that we all have a bit of the divine, that we're allowed to have a spark of that divine, that pilot with us. Yeah, we're here. We're just extraordinary that we're here. I mean, there's moments when you suddenly think, gosh, we're here. And it's such an incredible thing to be a human being and be here with all of those other people. And I often say sometimes that, everybody else has gone and there's only us here now. And that sort of sense that the only people here are us, and the world that we live in is also extraordinary. There's no one else. Everybody else is gone.
It's like knowing that the only moment we have is now.
The only moment we have is now. And, there'll be other people in the future, but for now, we're here.
For now, it's just us.
No, it's just us. Yeah, we're holding it. Huge responsibility.
Well, I think that kind of brings me to the last thing, which is how you see the relationship between the arts and the sacred.
Well, that's a really interesting and important question, because it kind of asks what, art's purpose has changed so much and is changing at the moment, I think, in a very important way. Because whatever art is, whatever we call it, it's part of the culture and the times, the era that it's made in.
Yeah.
So it's about asking us to see and do differently in ways that aren't just simply connected to the expectations or the expected way of behaving that we've come to know in the kind of whatever culture that we live within. But I think that art's changing in a very, very deep way, and that it's moving much more towards a sense of immateriality, of being about participation. So that art is a place which we can do things differently. We can experience and experiment with things in a different way. We can put things together differently, without harm, and that we can, in that way, model different ways to be. And I think for me, that's really important. So, and what artists do often is to invent, is to look at doing things differently. And it's like that thing, that we know that the world isn't as real as it looks. We know it is real and that it hurts if you fall and hurt yourself. But we also know that we can have an expanded consciousness, and that art can also take us there. And I think artists and spirituality, I think that artists can help us to do the things that I was talking about before, to find ways to be and to mark the thresholds of change that we're on during our lives. And in a funny way, everybody is an artist. Everybody has access, just like we all have access to that divine spark. But artists are people, and art's a practice that can kind of also help to take us there. So at Lewisham Unity, that's very important. And we've worked with artists, and we will continue to work with artists as well.
It's interesting, Claire, because you have such a long history in the arts, and as you're talking, I'm kind of visualizing all sorts of things which may have nothing to do with what you're saying. But there is that thing about we all able to create stuff.
Exactly.
And it may not be a painting or a poem or whatever. We're creating things, aren't we?
A painting or a poem. And I think that I think there's another really important aspect of art, which is about communities of learning. And whether they're, and in my experience in communities of learning in theatre, for instance, often in youth theatre or working in community theatre with adults, are people who, again, it's a little bit like church. It's where people come in and the rules change. The space can be different. You can do different things here. You can be a different person. You can talk differently. You can kind of experiment with things. And I think that sense that we can create things differently when we need those spaces. And we need those spaces where, we're not trying to make money out of them or sell ourselves or do anything, but they just allow us to be in a different way and to be held.
To be held and to be listened to, because you mentioned listening earlier. And I know from my own experience that when I listen well, the person I'm listening to does create themselves anew.
Exactly, it's true. I think that sense, and it's funny, I think this might be a better time of listening, actually, in this COVID time as well. Sure.
Well, yeah, we've all slowed down, haven't we? We've got time to listen more now.
So I think listening, I think you're right. I think listening, and the person you listen to is allowed to create, empowered rather, to create themselves anew. That there's sort of sense, actually, we don't necessarily always know who we are. We're potentially changing and we're potentially recreating. So I agree. Yeah, I don't think art's a decorative thing. I don't think it's just the icing on the cake. I think it's fundamentally important.
It's even when you go out and, like, if I go out and buy a picture from my wall, there's still an element of me going into that. It's like how I choose and the impact it then has on the space, and it is way more than just decoration.
It's way more than decoration. It's like, yeah, and we're moving into a more and more technological, technocratic society again, and actually getting rid of the arts in schools and music in schools and so on. And I think that's very wrong. I think actually the co-creativity and creativity in community is probably the best way that we can give people the tools to live their life together better. And I guess that's what we're trying to do in Lewisham Unity as well.
Yeah. And so you're just kind of you're a leader in that, aren't you?
I think,
a facilitator, or how do you see yourself?
I think leadership's a really interesting thing, because, I'm also an elder sister like you, and I think we have to be very, very careful about the leading edge, because it can also be a burden and it's not necessarily appropriate for everybody else. So I think turning the table in leadership. I read a lovely thing once by a minister called leading from the second chair, and it was about sort of, not being out in front, but sort of leading from somewhere else, which I thought was really lovely. So yeah, and shared leadership. I mean, it just kind of feels that there is definitely a move somewhere towards more communal, more communitarian sharing. Not everywhere. I mean, we could be moving into some really tough times, but I also think that that's present, and I think that's the kind of leadership. But I think leadership is also about taking responsibility, about being responsible and being a backstop, about things stopping with you, about having to take responsibility and making sure that you do it, all those things as well, I think.
I suppose for me also the thing about leadership is drawing somebody out so that they become their own leader, as it were.
Yeah.
But you, as you say, you're the backstop. You're the person they're going to go to and then say, I tried that and it was I'm into it. So that you can then enable them to see what went wrong and what they could do differently, and the fact they can do it.
They can do it, and trying to do that without fixing it, without judgment. I mean, all of that's very difficult. We're all falling off those edges all the time, and it's really difficult, to do that. And other people's lives always look so simple. You think, well, you just need to do that, you just need to go for more walks or make a list or anything. No, your own life is never like that.
Yeah. And actually, for a lot of the time, people don't want to be told what to do.
They don't, no.
Definitely not.
They want to be invited in. and given permission. I mean, it's just so many things. I think we're just so aware at this moment as well that people can be their worst selves very, very, very easily. They can be invited to be their worst selves, and they can also be their best selves. And we've all got all of that in us, I think. I mean, I kind of feel, you know, and I'm sure you do, because you're still, and you've had a renewed involvement in Quakerism. I know that religion in a sense, or even liberal religion, there isn't, you know, it's not something that's well understood. It's not a space, a cultural space that's really offered to people enough, I think, as a place where you can learn to be and you can expand who you are. And I know I'm not quite sure why that is. It's got a big history, but you know, it really feels to me that religious spaces are those spaces. And I've always felt that, where you're taken more seriously, where there's something big going on. Even as a child, I used to think, well, you know, this is about big things. Your life. Life means not just about, you know, spelling. It's about where we are in the universe.
Important decisions, not little tiddly ones. Yes, that's interesting, actually. And the churches that we knew as children were big spaces anyway.
And lots of people went to them, I think.
Yeah.
And I think it's partly just that people's lives are very different. So people don't have time, probably. I don't know. There's definitely a kind of spiritual revival, and I think it's taking place as well in music. A lot of musicians call themselves spiritual healers or see music as healing. There's a lot of sense that we need a kind of compassionate kindness. We need healing, but those things can float up and become superficial. They also need to be really grounded in a real practice, care and responsibility towards one another. And you know, I'm not saying that I do that either. Lots of people use themselves up completely, going completely crazy, trying to do all kinds of things. But it definitely is about how we live our lives. And you know, talk about the fact that we've known one another for such a long time. I mean, hopefully we've got a long way to go, but it is about how we live our lives. We don't normally have this conversation, but we've also, I think, recognized that our mothers had a big impression on us, that we're asking these questions because they've been there since our childhood.
Yeah.
They're still there. We're still older.
And what kind of mothers are we being to our children as well?
What kind of mothers are we to our children? I know. But, you know, we're lucky, actually, in so many ways that we, you know, we're lucky to be friends, and we're really lucky that our mothers...
I feel really lucky to have you as a friend, Claire.
I feel lucky to have you as a friend. Lucky.
Shall we leave it here before we get really sentimental about it all?
But it is really important. And in a way, you know, I got this thing, I'm sure there's a blessing in everything. And one of the blessings of this period has been being able to reflect and deeper. It's not true that you can't do it on Zoom either. So we will walk, of course, Sorrel. We will
walk. I am looking forward to walking with you again.
But in the meantime, it's just a beautiful conversation. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you so much as well.